She drew a line between us with 4 words, "You can't touch." But in her eyes I saw the truth she couldn't say. I first saw her when the rehearsal was winding down, the last echoes of music still drifting through the studio like smoke that refused to leave. The others had already gone, their laughter fading down the corridor, but she lingered, the way people who belong to a place always do. The mirrors reflected her from every angle, graceful, composed, almost untouchable. I was just gathering my things, trying not to stare, but failing. Her presence filled the room in a way I couldn't ignore. She wasn't the kind of woman you overlooked. Everything about her spoke of years of discipline. The posture of her shoulders, the fluid way she moved even when she was just picking up a scarf from the floor. She was older than me, I could tell, not just in age but in life. There was a kind of quiet authority in the way she carried herself, like she'd already lived through storms I couldn't yet imagine. I didn't expect her to notice me. But then she did. Her gaze lifted, steady and unreadable, catching mine in the mirror before turning toward me directly. It was just a glance, but it felt longer, the kind of look that says I see you before you're ready to be seen. I looked away, pretending to zip up my bag, though the truth was my hands had stilled. The faint scent of her perfume lingered in the air, something floral but subtle, softened by the warmth of the room and the faint tang of sweat from hours of practice. It wasn't overpowering, but it was enough to root itself in my memory. She crossed the floor with a silk wrap in her hands, its fabric whispering against itself. As she passed me, I caught the rustle of it, like the hush of a secret. "First time in here?" she asked. Her voice was low, smooth, carrying a trace of fatigue but edged with interest. I nodded. "Yeah. I didn't mean to stay this late." Her smile was brief, controlled, but it softened her face in a way that startled me. For just a second, she looked less like the poised, untouchable dancer and more like a woman letting her guard slip. "You'll get used to it," she said, adjusting the scarf over her shoulders. "Studios have a way of keeping people longer than they planned." There was a pause, not an awkward one but the kind that lingers when either person is ready to end the moment. I should have left then, I knew. But something in her eyes, something steady, something searching, made me stay rooted to the floor. And in that silence I felt it, the first spark of something I couldn't name yet. It wasn't just admiration. It wasn't just attraction. It was the pull of gravity, quiet but impossible to resist. When she finally turned away, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. That was the night I realized that sometimes the first touch isn't skin to skin. Sometimes, it's just a look across a mirrored room, and it lingers longer than you expect. The studio felt different the next evening. Quieter. The kind of quiet that wasn't just the absence of sound, but the presence of something unsaid. She was already there when I arrived, stretching near the mirrored wall, her movements sharp and elegant, as if even the simplest gesture had intention. I set my bag down softly, almost afraid to break the stillness. She glanced at me in the mirror, not startled, not exactly welcoming either, just aware. That same awareness that had pinned me the first night. For a while neither of us spoke. The piano music playing faintly from a speaker filled the air, slow and deliberate, matching the rhythm of her stretches. I found myself watching more than I should have, drawn to the way every line of her body spoke of discipline and control. Then, suddenly, she stopped. Straightened. Turned toward me. Her expression was calm, but her eyes held a certain sharpness, the kind that cuts through hesitation. "You can't touch," she said. The words came out evenly, not harsh, but not soft either. A line drawn in the sand. I froze, my throat tight. I hadn't done anything, hadn't even thought to, but somehow she'd read the question I hadn't dared to ask. Maybe it was in the way I looked at her. Maybe it was in the silence stretching between us. "I know," I said finally, my voice quieter than I meant it to be. Something flickered across her face then, something small, almost imperceptible. A hesitation, like she hadn't expected me to agree so easily. She adjusted the wrap around her shoulders, her fingers tugging at the fabric as if to steady herself. "This isn't," she exhaled softly. "It's not professional." It's not safe. Her words carried weight beyond their surface. Not safe for her, maybe. Not safe for me. Not safe for whatever fragile line we were towing in this empty studio. I nodded again, though my chest ached with things I didn't say. I understand. But my voice must have betrayed something, because her gaze lingered on me longer than before. Searching, almost questioning. Her hand lifted halfway, as if to emphasize her point, but in the motion it hovered close to my shoulder, close enough that I could feel the space where her touch almost was. Then, with a sharp breath, she pulled it back. The silence that followed was heavier than before. The piano music in the background seemed too soft, too delicate for the storm running beneath her calm face. I wanted to break the silence, to tell her that I wasn't trying to cross her boundary, that I respected it more than she realized. But the words stuck in my throat. Because in her eyes I'd seen something else, something that contradicted the firmness of her voice. Her lips parted, as if to speak again, but she didn't. Instead, she looked away, lowering her head and stepping back toward the mirror. "Let's work on the routine," she said, her tone measured, her composure carefully restored. And just like that, the wall was built again. But the thing about walls is, they don't stop you from feeling the heat on the other side. The next few evenings settled into a rhythm. She would lead, I would follow. Her voice would cut through the silence, calm but precise, guiding my movements the way a violin guides a melody. I learned quickly that dancing with her wasn't just about steps. It was about listening, not just to the music, but to her. The way she spoke, the way she moved, the way she let silence stretch when she wanted me to feel the weight of it. That night, the studio was dimmer than usual. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, leaving half the room in a kind of soft haze. We were the only two there, and the emptiness made every sound sharper, the squeak of my shoes against the floor, the steady count of her voice. "Again," she said softly. "You're rushing." I started over, trying to keep my body in time with hers. But my chest was tight with a nervous energy I couldn't shake. I was too aware of her, of the nearness of her figure, of the way her hand hovered near mine but never closed the gap. She stepped closer to adjust my stance. Her fingers brushed my sleeve, just a light contact, quick and unintentional, but it sent a shiver racing up my arm. I don't think she meant it, or maybe she did. Either way, the moment lingered. My body froze, not from fear, but from the realization of how much I wanted that touch to stay. She didn't look at me right away. Her attention stayed on my posture, her brow furrowed slightly, lips pressed together, as though she were determined to remain composed. "Like this," she murmured, repositioning my shoulder with a motion so slight it was barely there. Her fingertips grazed the fabric again, then slipped away. My breath caught. She must have heard it, because for a moment her eyes flicked up to mine, sharp and questioning. I held her gaze. I didn't speak, couldn't really. But something passed between us in that silence. A recognition. An admission neither of us dared to voice. Her hand withdrew completely then, folding neatly behind her back as if to erase what had just happened. She took a small step away, creating space that felt wider than the studio itself. "Better," she said, though I knew she wasn't talking about the dance anymore. I nodded, forcing myself to breathe evenly, to follow the steps as though my pulse wasn't thundering in my chest. We continued, her voice guiding me, her presence shadowing mine. Every time she circled around me, every time she leaned close to demonstrate, I felt the invisible thread pulling tighter. It wasn't touch. Not really. It was something in between, a restraint so palpable it had weight. By the time we finished, sweat clung to my forehead, my shirt damp against my back. She stood across from me, perfectly composed, a small towel draped around her neck. "Good," she said simply. And for a moment I thought I saw it again, that flicker of conflict in her eyes, that trace of something breaking through her carefully built wall. Then she turned away, and the spell broke. But the memory of her hand brushing my sleeve stayed with me long after I left the studio, as real as if it had never left at all. The rehearsal ended later than usual that night. The others had left long ago, their laughter trailing out into the night, but she and I remained in the studio, surrounded by the echo of our own footsteps. The music had stopped, yet the silence didn't feel empty. It was heavy, filled with the sound of our breathing, the creak of the wooden floorboards, the faint hum of lights overhead. She lowered herself onto the bench against the wall, exhaling slowly as if releasing more than just physical exhaustion. I hesitated before joining her, leaving a careful distance between us. For a while, we said nothing. She tilted her head back, eyes closed, a thin sheen of sweat catching the glow of the dim ceiling lights. Her scarf had slipped from her shoulders, and the sight of her, poised yet unguarded, stirred something in me I couldn't name. I stole a glance at her, and maybe she sensed it, because her voice broke the silence. "Everyone thinks strength is easy," she murmured, her eyes still closed. "But they don't see the cost of holding it together all the time." Her words surprised me. Not because they weren't true, but because she rarely allowed her vulnerability to show. I turned slightly toward her, listening. "You look so composed out there," I said softly. "Like nothing could shake you." Her lips curved in a small, tired smile. "That's the trick. You show them what they expect, not what you feel." Her eyes opened then, meeting mine. And in that moment, I saw the woman behind the dancer, the one who carried invisible weights no one applauded her for. I wanted to say something, to tell her I understood even if only a little. But instead, I reached into my bag and pulled out a water bottle, holding it out to her. She accepted it with a quiet, "Thanks," her fingers brushing against mine as she took it. The contact was brief, but it lingered in the silence between us. Her hand was warm, her skin soft despite the years of discipline etched into her every movement. She drank slowly, her throat moving with each swallow. When she handed the bottle back, her fingers lingered for just a second longer than necessary. Deliberate? Accidental? I couldn't tell. But I felt it. Her sigh followed, soft and almost vulnerable. "It's easier to teach, to perform, than it is to let someone close. Do you know what I mean?" I nodded. "I think so." And I did. Maybe not in the way she meant, but enough to feel the truth of it. The room seemed smaller then, the air warmer. We sat in silence again, but this time it wasn't distance, it was closeness, the kind that doesn't need words. When she finally rose from the bench, gathering her scarf around her shoulders, she looked at me once more. Something softer in her gaze, something hesitant. "See you tomorrow," she said. Her voice was steady, but the way her fingers adjusted her scarf betrayed the smallest tremor. And as I watched her leave, I realized the cracks in her wall weren't weaknesses. They were invitations. Quiet ones. Ones I wasn't sure I had the courage to answer. Yet, the studio was quiet except for the muted rhythm of our shoes against the wooden floor. The mirrors reflected our movements back at us, endless copies of two people circling closer, yet never crossing the line. She was patient tonight, more patient than usual. Her voice was softer, her instructions slower, as if she sensed my energy was frayed. "Relax your shoulders," she said. "Don't force it. Let the music carry you." I tried. But nerves got in the way. I stepped too quickly, stumbled, and my balance wavered. Before I could fall, her hand shot out, firm and sure, pressing against my chest to steady me. For a moment, everything stopped. Her palm was flat against me, right over my heartbeat. I felt the pressure of her touch through the thin fabric of my shirt, warm and grounding. The world narrowed to that single point of contact, the heat of her hand, the steady rhythm beneath it, the faint tremor in her fingers as if she wasn't as calm as she appeared. I didn't move. I couldn't. Neither did she. Her eyes lifted to mine, and the air between us grew heavier, thicker. The silence hummed with everything we hadn't said in the weeks we'd spent together. "You can't," she whispered, the words trembling as if rehearsed yet faltering. Her hand didn't leave my chest. I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening under her touch. "I know," I said softly. "But you don't want to let go either." Her lips parted slightly, as though she wanted to deny it, but no words came. She just stood there, her hand pressed firmly against me, her breath shallow and uneven. I could smell the faint trace of her perfume, mixed now with the clean salt of sweat from hours of practice. It was intoxicating, not overpowering, but close enough to make me dizzy. Her eyes flicked downward, to where her hand rested on me, then back up to my face. The conflict in her gaze was unmistakable, discipline fighting desire, restraint clashing with need. Seconds stretched into what felt like forever. Finally, with a sharp inhale, she pulled her hand back. The loss of contact was immediate, almost painful, like the absence of warmth in a cold room. She stepped away quickly, turning toward the mirror as if the glass could absorb her turmoil. "Again," she said, her voice steadier than her trembling hands betrayed. I nodded, though my chest still burned with the memory of her touch. We moved through the routine once more, but neither of us was focused on the steps anymore. Every glance in the mirror, every brush of movement between us carried the weight of what had just passed. And though she hadn't said the words, her silence had confessed enough. That night, as I left the studio, I carried with me the ghost of her hand against my chest, proof that her boundaries weren't made of stone, but of fragile glass. And sooner or later, one of us would push hard enough for it to shatter. The night she let me walk her out of the studio, the air was heavy, thick with the promise of rain. The city beyond the glass doors was hushed, the street lights blurring in the damp air, their glow smeared like paint across the pavement. We stepped outside together, and almost immediately the sky opened. Rain spilled down in sheets, soaking the ground, darkening the street. I laughed under my breath, more from nerves than amusement, pulling my hood up. She didn't. She simply stood there, scarf clutched around her shoulders, face tilted slightly upward as if the storm belonged to her. "You should get going," she said softly, though her feet didn't move. I shook my head. "Not until you do." She looked at me then, rainwater clinging to the loose strands of hair around her face. Her expression was guarded, but her eyes betrayed her. They searched mine the way someone searches for a truth they already know but don't want to admit. The silence stretched between us, louder than the patter of rain. I took a small step closer, heart hammering in my chest. "You tell me I can't touch," I said, my voice low, careful. "But everything in you says otherwise." Her lips parted, just barely, as if to protest. But no words came. The rain slicked down her scarf, dripping from her fingertips. I could see her trembling, not from the cold, but from the weight of everything she had been holding back. I swallowed, breath unsteady. "But you want me to." The words hung there, fragile as glass, waiting for her to break them. She didn't. Instead, she stepped closer. So close the rain between us disappeared, so close I could see the fine droplets clinging to her eyelashes, the rapid rise and fall of her chest. For a moment, I thought she might pull away again, rebuild the wall. But then, slowly, deliberately, she lifted her hand. Not to my chest this time, not to stop me. She placed it in mine. Her palm was warm against my skin, trembling slightly, but it didn't retreat. The storm raged around us, but in that moment the world was still. Her touch was both surrender and confession, quiet and undeniable. We stood there, hand in hand, not needing words. Her eyes searched mine, no longer deflecting, no longer hiding. And for the first time since I met her, she allowed me to see not the dancer, not the strong facade, but the woman beneath, all of her strength, all of her fear, all of her longing. "I shouldn't," she whispered, almost drowned by the rain. I squeezed her hand gently, grounding her. "Then don't say it. Just stay here with me." Her shoulders softened, her resistance melting away like the rain sliding down her scarf. We didn't kiss. We didn't need to. The hand she gave me was enough. It was more intimate than anything else could have been, because it was the first time she allowed herself to choose me openly. And in that quiet storm I knew this wasn't the end of our story. It was the beginning of something neither of us could keep pretending we didn't want. The studio felt different when we returned a few days later. The same mirrored walls, the same polished floor, the same faint scent of resin and sweat, yet the air between us had changed. She moved with the same grace, the same discipline, but her eyes no longer carried the same distance. Where there had once been walls, there was now space for something softer to exist. I noticed it in the way she stood closer as we warmed up. In the way her instructions came not with guarded detachment, but with the warmth of someone letting herself be present. "Relax your hand," she said gently, adjusting my wrist. Her fingers rested there a moment longer than they needed to. No withdrawal this time. No hurried step back. I looked at her reflection in the mirror. She caught me watching, and for once, she didn't turn away. The routine began, and we fell into rhythm. Our steps matched, our movements mirrored. There was a quiet harmony, as though the storm outside that night had washed away the last of our restraint. When I stumbled slightly on a turn, she laughed, not the short, polite laugh she used to give when she corrected me, but a genuine, warm laugh that lit her whole face. It startled me, how much I wanted to hear it again. We tried the step once more, and this time, without thinking, I reached out lightly for balance. My hand brushed her arm. She didn't flinch. In fact, she leaned just a fraction closer, her shoulder grazing mine. The contact was fleeting, but deliberate. An unspoken yes. When the music ended, we stood facing each other, breathless not just from the dance, but from the closeness we no longer tried to deny. She tilted her head, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Not bad," she said. I grinned. "High praise coming from you." She shook her head lightly, but her eyes softened. "Don't get used to it." But the warmth in her voice told me she meant the opposite. The silence that followed wasn't heavy anymore. It was comfortable. It wrapped around us like a shared blanket, easing the edges of everything we'd struggled against. I reached for my water, and as I did, she stepped closer, her hand resting briefly on my arm. Not by accident. Not out of necessity. Simply because she wanted to. That small gesture carried more weight than any confession could. It said, "I trust you. I'm not hiding anymore." The mirrors reflected us back, two people who had spent so long circling the line between what was allowed and what was wanted, now standing side by side, no pretense left. We didn't need to name it. We didn't need to rush it. What mattered was that the distance was gone. When she finally gathered her scarf and prepared to leave, she paused at the door, looking back at me. "Same time tomorrow?" she asked. Her voice was calm, but her eyes held a promise. I nodded, smiling. "I'll be here." And as the door closed behind her, I knew our story wasn't about a single touch, or a single night. It was about the slow, steady rhythm we had built together. A dance that was only just beginning. 14:1